If you were to take a snapshot of the United States of America in the winter of 1973, you would not see a superpower at the zenith of its glory. You would see a leviathan gasping for air, stranded on the beach of its own hubris. The images from that year remain some of the most humiliating in the American archive. Lines of automobiles stretching for miles, not for a rock concert or a grand opening, but for a few precious gallons of gasoline. The masters of the universe, the victors of World War II, were suddenly reduced to anxious hoarders, fighting with their neighbors at the pump, terrified that the lights were about to go out forever. To the casual observer, it looked like the end of the empire. The stock market was crashing, losing half its value in a slow, agonizing bleed. Unemployment was rising, inflation was devouring savings, and the president was drowning in the Watergate scandal. It was a portrait of impotence. But history has a dark sense of humor. What looked like a collapse was, in reality, a chrysalis. Amidst the fumes of exhaust and the stench of panic, a new, far more terrifying form of dominance was being incubated. The public saw a crisis. The elite saw an opportunity to rewrite the fundamental laws of gravity for the global economy. They were about to prove that while a factory can be bombed and a gold mine can be depleted, a system built on debt and desperation is eternal. To understand how the world arrived at this precipice, one must rewind 2 years prior to the original sin of the modern financial era. In 1971, the United States effectively declared bankruptcy, though they called it by a polite bureaucratic euphemism, the Nixon shock. For decades, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the American dollar had been the bedrock of global trade because it was invented as good as gold. $35 could be exchanged for 1 ounce of gold. It was a promise. It was a contract. But America, in its infinite wisdom, spent the 1960s fighting a disastrous war in Vietnam and building a great society at home, paying for both by printing paper money that it did not have the gold to back. The French, with their characteristic cynicism, noticed the scam first. They began sending battleships to New York Harbor, demanding to exchange their paper dollars for physical gold bars to haul back to Paris. The vaults at Fort Knox were bleeding. Faced with the choice of austerity or default, Richard Nixon chose the path of the scoundrel. On August 15, 1971, he closed the gold window in a televised address. He severed the dollar from gold, turning the world's reserve currency into a fiat hallucination backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States of faith that was rapidly diminishing. The dollar was now unmoored, floating in a chaotic sea of fluctuating exchange rates. The world had been defrauded, but it had nowhere else to go. The global economy was a ship without a rudder, drifting toward the iceberg. Then came the spark. If the economic foundation was rotting, it was the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 that kicked down the door. The attack by the coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria against Israel was a masterstroke of surprise, launched on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. For a brief, terrifying moment, it appeared that Israel might be overrun. In Washington, the panic was palpable. This was the Cold War. The Arab states were armed by the Soviet Union. A defeat for Israel was a defeat for the American sphere of influence. President Nixon, distracted by his own political implosion, authorized Operation Nickelgrass, a massive, desperate airlift of tanks, artillery, and ammunition to save the Jewish state. It was a logistical miracle, turning the tide of the war on the battlefield. But in the realm of geopolitics, it was a declaration of war against the producers of the world's energy. The Arab world, humiliated militarily, realized they possessed a weapon far more potent than Soviet tanks. They didn't need to defeat America on the battlefield, just needed to turn off the engine. The counterstrike was swift, silent, and devastating. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, led by the furious King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo against the United States and any nation that supported Israel. This was the moment the 20th century truly pivoted. For the first time in history, a group of developing nations, previously treated as mere gas stations for the West, grabbed the industrialized world by the throat. They declared that oil was no longer a commodity. It was a political weapon. They cut production. They choked the supply lines. The Seven Sisters, the giant Western oil companies that had ruled the desert for decades, were suddenly powerless. The flow of black gold, the lifeblood of every factory, every car, and every heating unit in the Western world, began to dry up. was a blockade not of ships, but of entropy. The West had built an entire civilization on the assumption of cheap, infinite energy, and overnight, the landlord had changed the locks. The result in the United States was the Great Panic. It is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend the sheer, visceral terror of the 1973 energy crisis. This wasn't just about paying a few cents more per gallon. It was about the sudden realization of fragility. The American dream was built on mobility, on the V8 engine, on the open road. Suddenly, the gas stations were empty. People woke up at 4 a.m. to queue for fuel, wrapping themselves in blankets, waiting for hours only to be told the pumps were dry. Violence erupted at service stations. Truckers blockaded highways in protest. The stock market went into a tailspin that wiped out a decade of gains. The government, in a display of flailing incompetence, imposed speed limits of 55 miles per hour and asked citizens to turn off their Christmas lights. The psychological blow was catastrophic. The narrative of American exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. was the master of its own destiny, was shattered. A superpower that could land a man on the moon was brought to its knees because a few monarchs in the desert decided to close a valve. But beneath the chaos, a new economic monster was being born: stagflation. According to the standard economic textbooks of the time, this monster shouldn't have existed. The Keynesian priests believed that you could have inflation, or you could have unemployment, but you couldn't have both. High prices came from a booming economy, they said, but 1973 proved them wrong. As oil prices quadrupled, the cost of everything: transport, food, plastic, heating skyrocketed. Inflation hit double digits. Yet because businesses couldn't afford the energy to run their factories, they laid off workers. Unemployment soared. The American worker was trapped in a vice. Money was becoming worthless, and jobs were becoming extinct. The misery index, the sum of inflation and unemployment, reached levels that threatened the social fabric of the nation. It seemed that the capitalist experiment had hit a wall. The engine was smoking, the wheels were coming off, and the Soviet Union looked on with glee, believing that the internal contradictions of the West were finally causing its collapse. Amidst this wreckage, the greatest wealth transfer in human history was taking place. It was a silent heist. Hundreds of billions of dollars were being siphoned from the pockets of American consumers and European manufacturers and flooding into the treasuries of the Persian Gulf. The sheiks were drowning in cash, were buying up London real estate, American banks, and luxury assets at a pace that made the robber barons look like paupers. The balance of financial power had shifted violently to the east. Europe and Japan, terrified of the cold and the dark, broke ranks with the United States. They issued statements supporting the Arab cause, desperate to secure their own oil supplies. The Western Alliance, NATO, the Brotherhood of Democracies, it all crumbled the moment the radiator went cold. It revealed a cynical truth: alliances are for times of plenty. Times of scarcity, it is every nation for itself. Yet it was precisely in this moment of maximum darkness that the seeds of the American resurgence were sown. The crisis revealed a fundamental truth to the cold-eyed realists in Washington, men like Henry Kissinger. They realized that the United States could no longer dominate the world through industrial production. Germany and Japan were catching up. The U.S. was becoming a net importer of energy. The old game was lost. But a new game was emerging. The world was awash in dollars, panic, and oil. If the United States could figure out a way to control the flow of this money, to harness the very crisis that was destroying it, it could build an empire that didn't rely on factories but on finance. The vulnerability, the dependence on foreign oil, could be inverted into a weapon. The chaos of 1973 was not the end. It was the painful, necessary destruction of the old industrial order to make way for the financial hegemony of the future. The empire was crumbling, yes, but only to clear the ground for a fortress built not of steel, but of debt. If the gas lines were the visible wound of the crisis, the infection that followed was far more insidious, attacking the very bloodstream of the American experiment. As the winter of 1974 set in, a new and terrifying word entered the lexicon of the Western world. A word that sounded like a medical diagnosis for a terminal illness: stagflation. For a generation of economists raised on the gospel of John Maynard Keynes, this phenomenon was a theological impossibility. The high priests of the post-war boom believed that the economy operated on a seesaw. You could have inflation, or you could have unemployment, but never both. If prices rose, it meant people were working and spending. If people were out of work, prices would fall. It was a neat, rational, controllable universe. But the oil shock murdered that god. Suddenly, the United States was trapped in a nightmare paradox where the rules of gravity no longer applied. Prices were skyrocketing, driven by the quadrupling cost of energy that bled into the price of fertilizer, trucking, plastic, and heating, while simultaneously, the economy was contracting into a deep, necrotic recession. The inflation rate tore into double digits, devouring the savings of the middle class like moths eating through a wool coat, while the unemployment lines lengthened with the grim monotony of a funeral procession. The misery index, the sum of inflation and unemployment, became the scorecard of national failure. For the average American worker, the psychological blow was devastating. The implicit social contract of the 20th century that if you worked hard, you would be richer than your parents was declared null and void. They were working harder, earning paper money that was worth less by the hour, to fill gas tanks that were empty, to drive to factories that were closing. The American dream was being foreclosed upon, not by a bank, but by a geopolitical reality that Washington was powerless to alter. Amidst this domestic carnage, a massive silent hemorrhage was draining the lifeblood of the West. It was the Great Wealth Transfer, a financial migration of such magnitude that it fundamentally altered the center of gravity of the planet. Every time a Western consumer managed to find gasoline, every time a European utility company bought fuel to keep the lights on, hard currency was stripped from the industrialized democracies and funneled directly into the treasuries of the Persian Gulf. It was a river of gold flowing uphill. 1970. The oil revenues of the Arab producers were a manageable trickle. By 1974, they had become a tsunami of hundreds of billions of dollars. The desert kingdoms, previously dismissed by Western diplomats as backward tribes living in tents, were suddenly drowning in more liquidity than they knew how to spend. This wasn't just economics. It was a humiliation. The sheiks of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the Emirates began a shopping spree that made the Gilded Age robber barons look like paupers. They bought prime real estate in London and New York. They acquired substantial stakes in the very Western corporations that had once exploited them. And they turned their capitals from sand-swept outposts into glittering metropolises of glass and steel. The West was being bought out, piece by piece, with its own money. The balance of financial power had shifted violently eastward. The industrialized nations found themselves in the humiliating position of beggars, sending finance ministers to Riyadh to plead for the recycling of these petrodollars, asking the oil kings to please deposit their windfall back into Western banks, so that the system would uncollapse entirely. It was a stark lesson in the new hierarchy. The factory owner is nothing. The resource owner is everything. As the economic pain deepened, the facade of Western unity began to crack. The crisis revealed that the Atlantic Alliance, that brotherhood of democracies forged in the fires of World War II, was terrifyingly fragile when the radiator went cold. This was the European divide. Faced with the prospect of freezing winters and industrial paralysis, America's staunchest allies broke ranks. They looked at the long gas lines in New York and decided they would not share America's fate. Japan, totally dependent on imported oil, was the first to capitulate, issuing statements distancing themselves from U.S. policy in the Middle East. Europe followed suit. France and Britain, desperate to secure their own bilateral deals with the Arab producers, effectively barred the United States from using their bases to resupply Israel. It was a diplomatic disaster. The United States, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world, found itself geopolitically quarantined. The special relationship with Britain evaporated the moment the British economy faced the abyss. The Europeans refused to form a united front of consumers, choosing instead to scramble for scraps from the OPEC table. NATO, the iron fist designed to hold back the Soviet Union, was revealed to be a paper tiger, paralyzed by the competing economic desperations of its members. The Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, watched with cynical dismay as the solidarity of the West dissolved into a chaotic every man for himself. The embargo proved that values, democracy, and shared history were luxuries. Energy was survival. When survival is at stake, there are no allies, only competitors. While the West cannibalized itself, a shadow was lengthening across the globe. The crisis was not a tragedy for everyone. For the Soviet Union, it was a miracle. Soviet opportunity had arrived. As the world's other great oil superpower, Moscow watched the chaos in the West with unconcealed glee. The skyrocketing price of crude was a divine windfall for the Kremlin. Suddenly, the inefficient, rotting Soviet economy was flushed with hard currency. The oil shock did what Marxism never could. It gave the USSR the financial muscle to match its military ambitions. Flush with petrodollars of their own, the Soviets went on the offensive. They upgraded their nuclear arsenal, reaching parity with the United States. They expanded their naval reach into the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. They poured money into proxy wars in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sensing that the American giant was staggering. To the strategists in the Pentagon, the nightmare scenario was unfolding. The United States was shrinking economically, militarily, and diplomatically, while the red bear was growing fat on the very commodity that was strangling the West. The Cold War, which had seemed to be settling into a stalemate, suddenly tilted dangerously in Moscow's favor. The fear in Washington was visceral, not just of a recession, but of a geopolitical defeat. If the economic hemorrhage wasn't stopped, the United States wouldn't just be poorer. It would be second-rate, a declining empire watching the sunset of its hegemony while the Soviets fueled their tanks with expensive oil and American weakness. It was in this atmosphere of existential dread, with the economy imploding, its allies defecting, and the Soviets rising, that the United States decided to play its final, most dangerous card. The solution would not come from the Treasury Department's printing presses, nor from the Pentagon's war rooms. It would come from the shadows. President Nixon, politically corpse-like as the Watergate news tightened, authorized a secret mission that would redefine the global order for the next half-century. The protagonist of this gambit was Henry Kissinger. He understood that the old world, the world of industrial dominance and gold-backed currency, was dead. It could not be resurrected. The United States needed a new architecture of power. If America could no longer produce the most goods, it had to control the money that bought the goods. Kissinger looked at the map and realized that the road to salvation did not lead through Paris, London, or Tokyo. It led to a kingdom in the desert that was swimming in cash, but terrified of its own shadow. In July 1974, a quiet, high-stakes diplomatic channel was opened with the House of Saud. The mission was shrouded in absolute secrecy. The objective was not merely to lower the price of oil. That was a short-term fix. The objective was to construct a mechanism that would permanently bind the wealth of the oil producers to the debt of the United States. Kissinger dispatched his new Treasury Secretary, William Samuna Brash, chain-smoking bond trader from Wall Street, to Riyadh. His briefcase did not contain threats of invasion, but a complex financial blueprint. The instructions were clear. Come back with a deal that saves the dollar, or don't come back at all. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The Americans were negotiating from a position of profound economic weakness, but they held one card that money couldn't buy: survival. The Saudi monarchy was rich, yes, but they were surrounded by enemies: radical secularists in Iraq and Syria, hostile Iran, and the ever-present threat of internal revolution. They sat on a throne of gold, but it was a throne built on sand. Kissinger's gamble was to offer them an iron dome of American protection, a guarantee that the House of Saud would rule forever, backed by the full might of the United States military. But the price of that protection would be the financial soul of the Arab world. As Simon's plane touched down in the shimmering heat of Riyadh, the stage was set for the greatest Faustian bargain of the modern age. The diplomats and bankers who gathered in those air-conditioned palaces were about to engineer an alchemy that would turn the American debt crisis into a weapon of global dominance. They were about to invent the petrodollar. The crisis had broken the American empire, but in the dark, frantic backrooms of 1974, the architects of the deep state were preparing to build a new one, not on the foundation of production, but on the unshakable pillar of the world's addiction to oil.